I'm Sangeeth. I'm a senior partner with McKinsey. I lead our work in the areas of city development and large-scale infrastructure projects. I'm joined here today by Guy Perry. Guy, if you may introduce yourself.
Yes, Guy Perry. I'm Vice President of Urban Planning and Design with McKinsey. I have a great deal of global experience prior to coming into McKinsey, as well as having taught at Harvard, MIT, and the University of Hong Kong.
Thank you. And Guy and I are thrilled to be anchoring this session today on livable cities. This is a topic that is really close to our hearts. I was actually originally meant to speak here on March 6th, and 90 days later, here we are. And during this time, phrases like the new normal or the next normal have entered our vocabulary, and they actually describe the world that we live in today. So just last week, the World Economic Forum published an article authored by Chimay Sangeeth. And the idea here was that there is actually nothing new about the new normal. And his fundamental argument is that the new normal must not be the lens through which we view the world. Since normal actually assumes that it is okay. But in reality, the way we lived pre-COVID is actually not the status quo that we would want to settle for. Whether it is inequality or silent epidemics such as mental health or NCDs to our carbon footprint, quote unquote normal was not really normal even pre-COVID. In fact, our higher aspirations for livable cities, our quality of life, calls for not a new normal, but a new paradigm. And this pandemic can be a massive accelerator for this new paradigm. And while the human cost here is absolutely tragic, history actually tells us that there is a rebound effect post-pandemic. If we look at the plague, cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis, the Spanish flu, the greatest cities actually adapted and then they rebounded. Whether it is Athens, whether it's London, Paris, New York, they actually came up with new innovations at that time, which spread to other cities post-pandemic. And some cities which did not adapt actually withered away. Some adaptations were short-term and others actually became long-term behavior. So how COVID will play out is anyone's guess. But one thing appealed to us, which was this idea of the new paradigm, the opportunity for a new reset, when everyone is actually going through new behavior at the same time. What an opportunity that presents to us as city designers and policymakers. So can we think of this moment as an accelerator for ideas that we should anyway commit to, with COVID acting as a trigger point for that acceleration? That's the fundamental premise for our talk today. And for the purposes of time, we have organized this into two major themes. One will cover the socio-economic aspects, and then the other will cover livability. But in a sense, they all speak to each other. They're not meant to be comprehensive or a portfolio by any means, but a thought starter on ideas that every city can consider coming out of the crisis. So I will lead us through the first set of ideas, which are focused on SMEs, culture, housing, around the socioeconomic angle. And my colleague Guy Perry will lead us through the livability ideas covering urban planning, transit, and environment. And we mean this for an interactive session, so we will take the liberty to intervene between us, but we would also welcome your questions and thoughts as a way to further this dialogue. So let me kick us off with the first theme on the economy. And the core idea here as an opportunity that we'd like to offer is predicated on the concept of urban regenerators, which are focused on SMEs. Let us explore this in a bit more detail. The facts are actually becoming quite clear now on the impact of COVID on the economy. And while all companies have had to adapt to disruption and greater uncertainty, SMEs are particularly susceptible. In fact, demand has declined dramatically since the onset of the pandemic. And according to several OECD surveys, more than half of the SMEs already face severe losses in revenues, and many have only a few months of reserves, some even less than a month. And this holds true from US to EU to China. And these SMEs account for 45% of total employment in emerging countries and about 70% in OECD. And the hardest hit sectors are also particularly vulnerable, and they include retail, hospitality, food service, entertainment services, construction. So they have an overrepresentation of SMEs, just given the local nature of the demand and the lower barriers to entry. In nearly every community, SMEs are the critical part of the economy. Their survival and ability to restart operations quickly, this will be a bellwether for the economy as a whole. That is absolutely clear. So government responses here have concentrated on helping SMEs survive the crisis, and a lot has been done. Nearly all measures actually introduced by government, they provide the basic measures. They help improve liquidity, postponement of payments, they help in value transfer to the businesses. So, payroll support, reduction in government fees, or even balance sheet support, loan guarantee programs and so on. But we need more, and this is where urban regenerators can come in. The response to support SMEs actually needs to be surgical, with a focus on regenerating entire communities. SMEs do not actually survive at an individual level. They rely on each other within a community. If you look at the footfalls, if you look at the demand profile, if you look at the real estate, access to talent, they're all interlinked within a community. So if cities can start planning and executing for the revival of SMEs with new types of institutions that are special purpose with the sole objective of revitalizing a community or groups of communities, this could be an unlock. And the role of regenerators would be to understand the community needs and become the single point orchestrator. And they could do a few things to support them. They can help unlock access to support, but in a fast and reliable way on what matters most: loans, cash grants, or credit guarantees, rather than a trickle down of federal support or state level support of one size fits all. They can also coordinate with SME nerve centers. They can align and coordinate efforts. And this would be planning at a community level and act as a feedback loop on how is the impact and the stimulus having, and feed that back to more sustained support. They can help build capacity and sustainability and competitiveness at a community level. And this can be by linking the SMEs to new demand sources. Maybe it is public procurement. Link the SMEs to government buying. It could be for capacity building and innovation support. Why not think of new digital storefronts, delivery options, and bring the SMEs at every community online? And finally, they can act as vehicles to help the SMEs scale up. They can spur entrepreneurship, support high growth SMEs with scale up. And we are starting to see early examples of these kind of assistance programs from Canada to South Korea to Singapore. But the innovation here comes from adapting regenerators that already exist. In fact, the city of Copenhagen, for instance, uses a new institutional vehicle. The institutional vehicle is public owned, but a private run corporation. They act as redevelopment vehicles. It's called the City and Port Development Corporation in Copenhagen. But this comes at it primarily from a real estate angle. By capitalizing vehicles with the land bank of that community or that district, it allows them to borrow against it and finance infrastructure projects and redevelopment projects. And no doubt, this is critical since access to financing would be critical at a local level. But if we can overlay such a vehicle with taking the lead on the entire revitalization of the community with a focus on SMEs, that could be an unlock and a new breakthrough. And with that anchor on community regenerators in mind, let us actually shift gears just in the interest of time and look at a related idea, which is around talent. And the core idea here around talent is there a concept we can consider of bringing the creative class back to the urban core? And the basis for this concept comes from an acknowledgement that in many of our high growth cities around the world, the people who have gotten crowded out the fastest are the creative class. UNESCO, in fact, defines 30 subsectors in its cultural framework. And if you look at the labor and talent profile of these subsectors, many are independent contractors, gig economy workers, and even part-timers. But this is only a narrow definition of the creative class. Dr. Richard Florida, who is a key exponent of this idea, he includes many other sectors such as technology and knowledge creatives in this definition. But however you define them, this is a group that is disproportionately impacted by the structural challenges that come from the growth and development, primarily unaffordability and increasing gentrification of our cities. Take San Francisco, take London, the rising housing costs make it very difficult for this community of the creative class to thrive at the urban core. But these creatives are the soul of many cities. They have a disproportionate impact on the vibrancy and the vitality of the cities. The adage goes actually that interesting people like to live next to interesting people. And I've also heard variations of this: talent begets talent, especially from a diversity angle. But whatever you prefer, a key imperative is there is an opportunity for cities coming out of COVID to create platforms for the creative class to thrive. And I'll focus on a couple of specific ideas for them. A few near-term ones are, if you can think about cultural development funds, there is a lot of capital that flows through to culture and the art scene. But if you think about funding them in a systematic way by measuring social impact, inclusion, and diversity, and creating outcome-based mechanisms, that will be a great way of creating a talent magnet through providing the right funding. The city can create the right demand profile to support the arts, and this might be through policies. You could argue that post-COVID, any redevelopment project or new build needs a portion of capex reserved for local art and culture, and even to make the entire city as a canvas, parks, interchanges. So you create the demand base load for the artists. In fact, the federal art program in the US is a great example. After the Great Depression, between 35 to 44, it established more than 100 community centers and sustained about 10,000 creative industry workers. So you could become the launchpad for the future generation. And imagine if this were to be replicated at a city and community level. You could also leverage the anchor assets, the museums, the performing arts centers, and more fundamentally repurpose the real estate, create affordable live and work places at central locations, which can feed into these communities. Dubai, Beijing, many global cities have attempted this. While it's not a precise playbook, the combination of these measures could be a fundamental opportunity for cities post-COVID to become a talent magnet for the creative class. I'm conscious of time, so maybe I'll hand over in the interest of time to Guy Perry. We've talked about the micro level of revitalizing communities. Perhaps let's look at the macro level on how to think about livability if you take the city as a whole, and clearly they talk to each other. Over to you, Guy.
Thank you, Sangeeth. I'll be touching on three areas. One is what is the right urban density as we go forward, because there's a lot of talk about how cities are changing in that way. We'll also talk about transport and how that's evolving, because as we've seen just in the last 6 months, the way we're using the cities, the way we're moving through cities has been quite different and gives us interesting options for the future. And then finally, an ecological and health imperative, which I would call kind of our habitat, if you will. So to start off with density, there's been a lot of movement away from cities over the last few months, as people who can afford to are actually exiting cities. And many people are also seeing, in the United States, for example, we're seeing a lot of demand for single family homes, more demand than we've seen in actually a couple of decades. And that comes from people, in a sense, reacting, I would say, in the short term to something which has been very difficult, which has been the lockdown. So one of the things that we should be thinking about is what would be the wise densities we go forward? Because we know there are a lot of negative issues that come with suburbanization at a low density level and single use areas. So as Sangeeth was saying, we need to be looking more at mixed areas that have various programs. Now, whether they are relatively high density areas, 20,000 people per square kilometer, or lower density areas that may be 3, 4, 5,000 people per square kilometer, we still have to be looking at a mixity of uses. Keep in mind also that the way we're using our home is very different than it was 6 months ago or so for many of us. In other words, there's absolutely a blurring of the traditional limits, or let's say the limits of the last 100 years or so, of working in one place, living in another place. And these things, that they come together, afford a lot of opportunities in terms of the kind of density, the kind of mixity that we can create in our urban environment. So I think we're going to see a lot of repurposing, as Sangeeth mentioned. We're going to see some, shall we say, adjustments to certain existing buildings in order to make them not only economically viable, but to actually create a different level of vibrancy in the community. If we go to issues of transit, the way we move around the city is fundamental in terms of shaping life patterns. What we have noticed, of course, is that we don't need to be commuting every day. For people who have office jobs, they're often now working online. And we've actually gotten relatively comfortable with that. Now, whether we want to be working at home all the time or we want to be commuting occasionally, this takes an enormous amount of burden off of the roadway infrastructure, for example. Now, one of the challenges is, what are we going to do with mass transit as we go forward? Because obviously there's a certain proximity by the nature of that transit for the people using it. And obviously we're looking at ways of being able to subdivide. I'm in constant contact with my colleagues in Hong Kong, how they're pioneering certain ways of ensuring that you can still move quite a few people, because in that city you have 90% of the people are commuting by public transportation. So they really have to be at the edge of the curve. And what we're finding is that we're probably going to be reducing some of the densities in terms of transportation, public transportation, but it may be offset by the fact that many people will be able to work at home as we go forward. I would also like to propose that we need to be thinking about different kinds of vehicles. If we are going to be seeing the personal vehicle as a kind of safe haven to move through the city, we need to be looking at a reduced format of personal vehicles. We can't be looking at the size of vehicle that we're looking at today if we're going to see additional vehicles using urban areas. But I'd also like to say one of the most interesting things that's happened over the last few months is the repurposing of the streets in many cities. In other words, those streets that were once largely devoted to the automobile, they are now being used as a kind of what we call shared street, which is a place where you walk, a place where you can bike. The automobile no longer has that priority. Now, very interestingly, it was in 1924 where a deal was struck between a major auto manufacturer in the U.S. and the U.S. government to basically turn over the U.S. streets to the automobile. We're coming up on that anniversary, so it'll be interesting to see if we can't reconsider that for many of the second-tier streets in our cities. Probably not the arteries, of course, because we need those to be quite free-flowing, but looking at something where we could have a more humane pace of traffic on the secondary streets. And that might even be enforceable before we have autonomous vehicles through elements like geofencing, which can allow us to control the speed of vehicles in an urban area in a very precise way. Finally, I'd like to touch on the ecological and health imperative, the opportunities that come from this post-COVID period. We have an opportunity now to be rethinking how we actually use the city. One of the things that has come about is that many more people are actually out now, walking around, actually physically using the city once they have been released from the lockdowns. They're actually feeling their neighborhoods, seeing their neighborhoods in a very different way than they had before, when they might just, in a sense, exit their home and take off to a different part of the city. So there's a different level of granularity and appreciation to how people are living. And I often use the term city as gym. And what I mean by that is that if the city is well designed, and if it is engaging to you as a citizen, you are actually just going to naturally walk your 10,000 steps a day as pleasure. You're not going to actually have to go in and work out of the gym because you've been sitting in traffic for hours that day, you've been sitting in front of a screen for hours that day, but rather the city itself is going to engage you in such a way that you will be physically active and you will be in harmony with yourself, which is why I often call urban areas habitats, because if they are off register, we actually get off register as well. So NCDs, so whether that's obesity, diabetes, hypertension, these are at the highest levels we've had as a species. And that is because of our life patterns, and is because of the cities that push us into these life patterns. So we need to, in a sense, maybe readdress that post-COVID, bring the city back to a human metric. Then finally, the environmental issues. I think what's fascinating is that many cities had not seen as clear air as they did a month or two ago in decades. And that had to do with, of course, our human activity being dramatically slowed down. One of the things that we need to be looking for as we move forward is how do we achieve those levels of air quality while we restart the economy, so that we just don't go back to that, shall we say, normal that Sangeeth started off by questioning. And I absolutely agree with him that this is a moment in history where we can take advantage of a reset. It's not just a pivot, it's a reset in terms of how we live our cities. And I think if we don't, we will have missed a unique opportunity. So it may be that obviously there's been enormous suffering here, but if we learn from this period of challenge, we will actually have better environments as we go forward. So I think there may be some questions from the audience, and Sangeeth, you may have some words that you'd like to add.
Yeah, I think if we'll wait for any questions from the audience, and in the 4 minutes that is left, perhaps one additional theme that I would add in is that of shelter or housing, which continues to be a key policy consideration for cities post-COVID. The current model for housing in many fast growth cities is to build new at the urban periphery, including informal settlements. And this is both for migrant workers and for expanding the city growth. But one might go so far as to say it's actually better to provide no housing than housing at the wrong location, because the act of planning where you live can create perverse effects, including poverty traps. So I'd like to maybe close this with two opportunities also linked to post-COVID that cities can think about. The first is rethink the settlements, dormitory, social housing scheme with minimum infrastructure, because no amount of resilience measure can buffer against not having basic sanitation and fortification for physical distancing if and when required. But the second is to fundamentally rethink the housing ladder. The idea here is that, especially in the post-COVID scenario, city dwellers will need flexibility. They'll need tenure, tenancy, variety of options to align with the idea of labor mobility. People will need to move around a lot. They will change jobs. There will be surges in specific job types. There'll be decimation in others. And giving flexible housing options across the city that enables labor mobility is the big idea here. And the change in work behaviors could be a major catalyst. Commercial real estate might see a major shift in demand profile in the coming years. And this could be a fantastic opportunity to repurpose, adapt, rezone, and in fact, leverage existing assets in a better way to provide the workforce with shelter. So in conclusion, all of these themes, as you can imagine, talk to each other, whether it is SMEs and urban regenerators, to bringing back the creative class, to affordable shelter. This is about solving for it at a community level. But at a macro layer, rethinking and using this opportunity, not as a pivot, but as a reset, as Guy said, to rethink density, to think about transit and think about our ecology. This is a fantastic opportunity with very practical ideas that mayors and city policymakers can start implementing right away. And that would be our provocation for this talk. Thank you again for having us. It's been a pleasure. We're delighted to continue this dialogue in any way possible. Thank you.
Thank you.